It had been just over a year since Amanda died. We had been divorced for nearly 3 years when it happened. A car accident out on some wet back road near Fayetteville. I remember hearing about it from her sister, who still occasionally called me out of habit or maybe guilt. It wasn't my business anymore, not really, but we had history, a lot of it. So when I heard she was gone, I didn't know how to feel. I sat in my truck that night, drinking a warm beer in my driveway, staring at the dark sky and not really thinking anything at all. It was like a switch had been flicked off inside me. We never had kids, no shared house, nothing tying us together in any physical way after the divorce, except one thing: the cabin. It sat out near the Blue Ridge Mountains, tucked deep into the woods off a narrow gravel road that no one had maintained in years. We bought it together in 2012, back when we still believed everything would work out. No running water, no electricity, just a rotting box of pine wood with a metal roof and a stone chimney. It had been her idea, some place to escape to, fix up slowly, something we'd grow old in. We went up there a few times a year at first, less often as things fell apart. After the divorce, I never went back. She kept it in the paperwork, and I figured she'd sell it or forget it. But she didn't. That was the strange part. Her sister, Janine, told me Amanda had gone up there a lot in the final year before she died. More than anyone expected. Sometimes for days at a time. Alone. No one knew exactly what she was doing up there. She wouldn't tell her family much. She had gotten quieter after the divorce. She drank more, canceled plans, quit her job at the library. Her online activity dropped off too, according to her cousin, who stalked her Facebook page like it was a religious duty. It was like she had faded into the trees, one long breath away from disappearing entirely. So when Janine asked if I wanted to take ownership of the cabin again, saying it was what Amanda would have wanted, I hesitated. I didn't have to, I didn't want to, but something kept gnawing at me about it. I told her I'd think about it, and a few weeks later, I drove out there. Not to sign any papers, just to see it. One last time. It was the end of October 2023. Leaves had started falling early that year. Cold for Georgia, even up in the mountains. I left my apartment in Dalton around 9 in the morning and drove straight through without stopping. A thermos of black coffee in my cup holder. My mind mostly empty, just the way I liked it. No music, just the road and the sound of tires over cracked asphalt. It took almost 4 hours to get to the trail that led to the cabin. The last 2 miles were on a dirt road that had nearly disappeared under leaves and rain washouts. I had to stop halfway up and walk the rest. I left my truck parked off the side of the road, locked it, and threw my backpack over my shoulder. Inside I had a flashlight, a folding knife, bottled water, a sandwich, a change of socks, and a small first aid kit I hadn't used in years. It wasn't much, but I figured I'd only be up there a few hours. I followed the old deer trail that cut through the brush, ducking under branches and stepping over roots. It was familiar in that way where your body remembers before your mind does. Muscle memory took over. The sharp incline just before the stone outcropping. The rusted fence post we never pulled out. The clearing up ahead. And then there it was. The cabin hadn't changed. Not much anyway. The roof was still intact. The door looked a little warped. One of the side windows had cracked, maybe from a fallen branch. The place looked like it always had. Abandoned but not forgotten. Like something left behind on purpose. I stood there a long time just staring. A squirrel darted through the underbrush. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a hawk called. Otherwise, it was dead quiet. I walked up to the porch, my boots crunching old leaves and dry pine needles. The steps creaked under my weight. The padlock Amanda had put on the front door was rusted, but I had brought bolt cutters. It snapped off with a short groan of metal. The door stuck a little, but I forced it open. Inside, it smelled like mold and dust and something else I couldn't place. Not decay, not animal, just strange, thick, heavy, like someone had burned old paper and wet wood and left the ashes to rot. I walked in and looked around. The furniture was still there. The same couch we bought from a thrift store. The same table I sanded and stained one summer when Amanda begged me to do something productive. There was a pile of firewood near the fireplace, some canned food on the shelf in the corner, a folded blanket on the chair. And then I saw the notebook. It was on the table, spiral bound, the same kind Amanda used to carry in her purse. I picked it up and flipped it open. Inside were pages and pages of small, tight handwriting. All of it hers, but it wasn't journal entries. Not exactly. It was lists, names, numbers, crossed out lines, notes about trails, supplies, weather. One page had just a single sentence written over and over again. I hear them at night. I stared at it for a long time. The words didn't make sense. Amanda wasn't paranoid. She wasn't superstitious. She didn't believe in ghosts or demons or anything like that. We used to laugh at people who did. So I kept reading, flipping further into the notebook. There were dates: March, April, July, all from 2023. Notes like, third night in a row, same footsteps, not animals, too slow, too heavy, left trail markers, found them moved next morning. No sleep again. What do they want? My stomach tightened. I didn't know what to make of it. Was she having a breakdown? Losing her mind out here alone? Or was it something else? Something more grounded but just as frightening? I set the notebook down and walked through the rest of the cabin. Nothing looked disturbed. No sign of rodents or intruders. The back door was locked. The crawl space entrance hadn't been touched. But something still felt wrong. The air was too still. The silence too thick. I checked my watch. It was just after 3 p.m. I should have left then. I had seen enough, but instead I stayed. Something in me wanted to understand. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe just plain curiosity. I opened the stove door and cleared out some old ashes, stacked a few logs and got a fire going. I sat down on the couch, drank some water, and opened the notebook again. I didn't hear anything until it was almost dark. It started with a single thud outside, like something heavy had dropped in the dirt. Then another, closer this time. I stood up, heart thumping, and walked slowly to the window. I couldn't see anything through the glass. Too much glare from the fire. So I opened the door, just a crack, and listened. Nothing. Just wind in the trees, the faint creak of a branch. I shut the door again and double-checked the lock, even though it wouldn't stop anything serious. Then I went to the back room and looked through the old hunting binoculars we kept in a drawer. I scanned the treeline. That's when I saw it. Not a person, not an animal, just a shape, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, still facing the cabin. I ducked away from the window so fast I banged my head on the wall. My breath caught in my throat. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. Then I peeked again. It was gone. I stayed inside the rest of the night, sitting on the couch with the fire dying down and my hand wrapped around the knife in my lap. I didn't sleep. Not 1 second. I just listened. And around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow. Dragging, right outside the wall.
No flashlight.
No phone. I didn't want to move. I didn't want whoever or whatever it was to know I was awake. The steps circled the cabin twice, then stopped. Nothing after that. When the sun rose, I stepped outside. There were footprints.
Boot prints.
Deep, fresh. But the weird thing was there were no prints leading in. Just the circle around the cabin and then nothing, like someone had been dropped there from the sky. I packed my things, locked the cabin again, and left. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I just walked, steady and calm, all the way back to the truck. I didn't stop to drink water. Didn't stop to catch my breath, just kept going. I never told Janine, never signed the cabin over. As far as the state is concerned, it's still Amanda's. No one's bothered to ask about it since. Sometimes, late at night, I take out the notebook. I keep it in a drawer by my bed. I reread her last entries, the ones she wrote days before her accident. They don't like the fire. They wait until I sleep. I think they're people, or they were. If I don't make it out, someone needs to know. And then the last one, they're inside. I know it doesn't make sense. I know people will say it was grief or mental illness, but I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt in that place. Whatever Amanda found out there, it changed her. Or maybe it was always out there, waiting for someone to be alone long enough, quiet enough to notice. I haven't been back since, and I never will. It was the fall of 2013 when I drove out to a remote hunting cabin in southern Oregon. I was 31 back then, working a factory job near Eugene, and needed a break from the routine and the noise. I had a few vacation days saved up, so I planned a solo trip out into the Cascades to hunt elk. It was the kind of getaway I craved. Quiet, slow-paced, no one around for miles, just me, the trees, and whatever game wandered my way. I borrowed my buddy's old pickup, a 95 F-150, since mine wasn't suited for the kind of roads I'd be driving. The cabin wasn't mine either. It belonged to a friend of my late uncle. It sat near a creek at the base of a ridge a few hours southeast of Roseburg, in a spot that didn't even show up properly on Google Maps. No cell service, just an old dirt track cutting through dense pine and fir forests, winding down toward a clearing with nothing but that aged wooden structure and a fire pit out front. I left early in the morning, sometime before sunrise. The fog was thick, curling along the roads like smoke. The drive was rough for the last couple of hours. I had to crawl the truck along steep, rutted Forest Service roads that looked like they hadn't been touched since the 80s. When I finally pulled into the clearing, I killed the engine and sat for a minute, letting the silence settle in. It was quiet out there, still, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring because there's nothing to fill the space. The cabin was small, built from dark logs that were blackened in some places, probably from decades of weather. There was a stack of old firewood leaned up against one wall, damp with dew. The front porch sagged a little, and the door creaked like a coffin lid when I pushed it open. Inside, it was what I expected. A cot, a stove, a small table, a few shelves with dusty old tins of food and rusted tools. A lantern hung from a beam. I checked it and found a little fuel left. The outhouse was about 30 feet out back, almost swallowed up by overgrowth. After unpacking the truck and settling in, I got the stove going with some kindling and boiled water for coffee. I spent the first day just hiking the area, checking out the terrain, looking for signs of elk, tracks, droppings, tree rubs. The woods out there were thick but manageable. Steep in places, lots of downed trees. I spotted a few deer but no elk. Still, I wasn't in a rush. I planned to be there 5 days, maybe 6 if the weather held. That first night was cold. I had brought a thick sleeping bag, and the stove helped, but the cabin creaked and popped all night. I lay awake listening to the fire fade. The wind brushed the walls, and the steady ticking of cooling metal. You don't realize how loud nothing can be until you're in the middle of it. The next morning, I headed up the ridge to scout again. I packed light, rifle, water, a sandwich, and a compass. I marked trees with orange ribbon on the way up, just in case I lost track of my return path. The forest up on the ridge was different. The trees were denser, older. Some of them looked like they'd been dead for years but still stood tall, gray and stripped of bark. Around mid-morning, I found fresh elk tracks near a small game trail that cut across the slope. I followed them for a bit, but they disappeared into thick brush. I sat and waited a while, watched the area, but nothing moved. It was just me and the sound of wind brushing leaves. I returned to the cabin by early evening, made a small fire out front, and cooked a bit of canned stew. The stars came out, clearer than I'd seen in years. The Milky Way ran straight over the top of the cabin like someone had spilled salt across black velvet. It was peaceful, and for a moment, I forgot about the stress back home. But even then, something about the place didn't sit quite right. There was a feeling, hard to explain, like being watched but not in a movie kind of way. More like when you walk into a room and just know something's been moved, even if you can't say what. I chalked it up to being alone and not used to the quiet. The third day is when things started to feel off. I woke up early, probably around 5 a.m. It was still dark, but I wanted to get higher up the ridge before the sun broke. I packed my gear and locked the cabin door behind me with the old hasp and padlock that hung crooked on the frame. I made sure to take the key with me. That hike was colder than the day before. Frost covered the dead leaves. My boots crunched as I moved. I reached a high spot just as the light started creeping between the trees. I waited there for a few hours, eyes peeled and ears sharp. I saw a bull elk in the distance around mid-morning, too far for a clean shot, but it was something. I marked the spot on my map and planned to head back there the next morning. On my way back down, I cut through a different part of the forest, thinking I'd get a better view of the creek that ran behind the cabin. As I came around a bend, I saw something strange. A boot print, not mine, bigger than mine, heavier tread. It was set deep in the soft ground. I stopped and checked my surroundings. No other sign, no sounds either. I didn't like it, but it was public land. Could have been another hunter. Still, I'd seen no vehicles, no sign of other people for days. Back at the cabin, I found something else that rattled me. The lock on the door had been turned. Not busted or forced, just unlocked. I was sure I'd locked it. I even remembered slipping the key in my pants pocket. I stood there for a minute, listening. Nothing inside looked disturbed. My gear was where I left it. My sleeping bag still bunched up on the cot. But the air felt different, cooler inside than it should have been. Like the door had been open for a while. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept the rifle loaded and leaned against the wall within reach. The wind picked up around midnight, and the trees groaned. Something thumped lightly on the roof once, but it might have been a pine cone or branch. I didn't check. I stayed in the sleeping bag with my hand on the rifle and my ears wide open. The next day, I went back up the ridge and checked the area where I saw the elk. Nothing. No movement. No tracks. Like they vanished overnight. I felt uneasy the whole hike. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following. Every little sound made my skin crawl. Twigs breaking, birds scattering. I was alone, but it didn't feel that way anymore. When I got back, I found fresh tracks behind the cabin. They weren't mine. The tread was the same as before, deep, wide, like from a heavy boot. They circled the cabin once and then went off toward the creek. I followed them about 30 yards, but they disappeared at the water's edge. There was no other path, no signs of return. It made no sense. That night, I didn't light a fire. I kept everything dark. I ate cold food and stayed in the corner by the cot, rifle across my lap. I watched the door, the windows, every shadow that moved. I didn't sleep at all. Just before dawn, I heard something outside. Not an animal. Footsteps, slow, crunching leaves, just beyond the cabin. Not running, not pacing, just walking. I held my breath. The steps came up to the porch, then stopped. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would shake the walls. There was a sound at the door, metal against metal. The lock. Someone was testing it. I almost pulled the trigger through the wood, but they didn't come in. After about 30 seconds of silence, The steps backed away, slow and quiet, and then faded into the woods. I waited until full daylight before I opened that door. There were fresh boot prints again, clear as day, right up to the door. Then nothing. No tracks leading away, just gone. I didn't waste time. I packed everything, threw it into the truck, and left. I didn't even eat. I didn't look back. I drove until I hit asphalt, then drove some more. By the time I got home that night, I was exhausted, paranoid, jumpy. I checked every lock on every door and window twice before I finally passed out on my couch with the lights on. I never went back to that cabin. A few weeks later, I mentioned the trip to the guy who loaned me the place. He raised an eyebrow and said the last few people who used it complained about weird stuff. One guy thought he was followed. Another said his trail cameras were moved. They'd all written it off as nerves or wild animals. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw.
No ghost. No monster.
Just a man. A real person who knew the land better than me. Who moved quiet, who watched without being seen. Someone who wanted to get in that cabin, maybe just to scare or maybe for worse. I've hunted since then, but never alone, and never in a cabin that far off the map. Some places are better left to the trees. It was the summer of 2017 when I booked a remote cabin in the Scottish Highlands. I was 29, just out of a rough patch in my life, and I needed time alone. I'd been living in Manchester and working in tech, spending most of my days behind screens, sitting in traffic, eating takeaway, and getting more miserable by the week. A breakup earlier that year pushed me into that numb, floaty phase where nothing really matters. I didn't want to go on a trip with anyone. I didn't even tell many people I was leaving. I just found a listing online for a small, off-grid cabin near a loch about an hour outside Fort William, and I booked it for 9 days. The listing was short and didn't give away much. A local farmer apparently rented out this cabin on his land during the summers. It had no Wi-Fi, no phone signal, and you had to bring your own supplies. That was perfect. I didn't want to talk to anyone or check anything online. I wanted to go somewhere I wouldn't be found easily, and I found it. I drove up from Manchester in my silver Peugeot 206. It was a long drive, but the farther I got from the cities and motorways, the better I felt. Once I was in Scotland, the roads narrowed, and everything got quieter and greener. I remember the last stretch, driving on a single-lane road with tall trees on either side, hills rolling beyond, and barely another car in sight. It was peaceful, felt like I'd stepped out of time. I reached the spot around 6 p.m. The directions told me to pull into a gravel track just past a rusted green gate on the left. I almost missed it. The sign was weathered wood nailed to a fence post and just said Carn Glass Bothy in faded letters. I drove slowly down the rocky path, my tires crunching over stones and mud. Trees leaned over the track like old arms, and everything smelled like damp moss and pine. After maybe 400 yards, the trees opened up into a clearing. The cabin sat alone near the tree line, a squat, dark wooden structure with a slate roof and a small porch in front. Beyond it was a wide view of the hills and a glimpse of the loch below, maybe a 15-minute walk away. The cabin looked worn but sturdy. I killed the engine and stepped out. The quiet was thick. There was a small outhouse a few meters from the cabin, and a thin path that wound off into the woods behind. I didn't explore right away. I just hauled my bags from the boot and let myself in. Inside, it was dim but clean. A single room with a narrow bed, a wood-burning stove, a table, and a tiny kitchenette with a portable gas stove and a couple of shelves. No electricity.
No plumbing.
The walls were unpainted timber. A lantern hung from a nail near the door, and there were old hooks for coats. The bed had clean sheets, and the place smelled faintly of smoke and earth. It was perfect. I spent the first 2 days doing nothing but reading, walking around the loch, making simple meals, and just listening to the quiet. The air was cool even in July. The only sounds were birds, insects, and the occasional creak of the trees. I didn't see a single person. No cars.
No planes o overhead.
It was like the world had forgotten this place. On the third evening, I noticed something strange. I was sitting on the porch just before sunset. The sky was turning orange over the hills. I had a blanket wrapped around me and a cup of tea on the step. I was watching the edge of the woods where the path disappeared into the trees. That's when I saw movement. At first I thought it was an animal. A deer maybe, but it was tall, a person. A woman. She stepped halfway out from the tree line, paused, then moved back into the shadows. She was too far for me to make out her face, but she was wearing something long and pale. A coat or a dress. I couldn't tell in the fading light. My stomach went tight. I hadn't seen a soul in 3 days. Who would be walking through the woods this far out? There were no other houses.
No trals.
I stared at the spot where she'd been for a long time. Nothing moved. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, but that was it. Eventually, I went back inside and tried to shake it off. Could have been a hiker, maybe a local, maybe she got turned around. But the next morning, when I went outside, I found footprints in the dirt near the tree line.
Bare footprints. No shoes.
Small, with narrow toes and long heels. They led out of the woods, stopped near a patch of tall grass, then turned back. It was strange. It made me feel watched. I spent most of that day inside. I didn't even go to the loch. I just read, drank tea, and stared out the window more than I'd like to admit. I didn't see her again that day. That night, I locked the door and slid one of the chairs in front of it, even though the door had a bolt. The wind picked up that night. The cabin creaked a bit, the way wood does when it settles. I barely slept. The next morning, I decided to walk toward the spot where I'd seen her. The path behind the cabin led into the woods, and I followed it. It was narrow and overgrown. After 10 minutes of walking, I found what looked like an old dry stone wall, mostly crumbled. Beyond that was a thicket of birch trees. The ground was soft and damp. I didn't see any signs of a house or a camp. No one had been through there recently, or so I thought. But as I was turning back, I found something. It was a white sock, small, worn out, sitting on a rock like someone placed it there. It was damp but not soaked. I picked it up without thinking, then dropped it again. Felt wrong. When I got back to the cabin, I double-checked the locks. I pushed the chair back under the door handle. I kept the lantern close. That night, something woke me up. I don't know what time it was. Maybe 2 or 3 a.m. The wind had died down. It was quiet, too quiet. Then I heard it, a soft scraping sound. Wood against wood. From the porch. I sat up in bed and strained my ears. The sound came again. A dragging noise, like something heavy being moved. Then a faint, wet tap, 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 like fingers on the glass. The cabin had one small window above the bed. I turned slowly and looked up at it. There was a face, just a shape really, pale, pressed against the window from the outside. I couldn't see her clearly, but I knew it was a woman. Her head tilted slightly, and I froze. She stayed there for maybe 10 seconds, then vanished. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat on the floor with the axe I'd brought for chopping wood and waited for daylight. In the morning, I walked outside. There were footprints again right under the window. Same as before, bare, small, slightly deeper in the mud this time. There was something else too. A long, brownish stain on the wooden porch boards. It looked like blood that had dried and cracked. I should have left. I know that now, but I told myself maybe it was an animal. Maybe I imagined the face. Maybe the footprints were old. I didn't want to admit I was scared, but I was. Every part of me was screaming to leave, and I didn't listen. 2 nights later, it got worse. I had started sleeping during the day and staying up all night. I kept the lantern lit. I moved the bed so it wasn't directly under the window. I barely ate. I was just waiting. Around 1 a.m., I heard movement outside again. Not just footsteps this time. Breathing, slow and raspy, right outside the wall. Then something touched the door handle. It jiggled softly, then again a little harder. The bolt held, but the door creaked under the pressure. I stood with my back against the opposite wall, the axe in my hands, my heart thudding in my ears. The jiggling stopped. Silence. Then footsteps, soft but fast, circling the cabin. I backed into the corner and waited. Then I heard it. A slow, dragging noise on the roof. Something or someone had climbed up there. I didn't move. Then came the worst sound I've ever heard in my life. A kind of low, dry chuckle, right above me. It was not loud. It wasn't cartoonish. It sounded like someone choking back laughter with a mouth full of dirt. I stayed frozen until dawn. When the sun came up, I packed everything I could into my car in under 10 minutes. I didn't clean the cabin. I didn't check the woods. I didn't lock the door. I just drove. Even now, years later, I don't know who she was or what she wanted. I don't know why she didn't break in. Maybe she liked watching more than acting. Maybe she just enjoyed fear. All I know is that what I saw was real, and I wasn't supposed to see her. When I later looked into the history of that area, I found almost nothing. No missing persons. No reports. The farmer who listed the cabin online never replied to my emails. Eventually, the listing disappeared completely. I told a friend once, just once, and he said maybe it was a squatter or someone off-grid. But I know what I saw. That woman wasn't just lost. She came back multiple times. She was quiet, careful. She wasn't trying to be found. And I was the only one there. I never went back to Scotland after that. I moved flats, changed my car. I still love being alone, but now I only go to places with neighbors nearby, lights at night, and solid locks. I can't stand silence anymore. Not real silence. Because when things get too quiet, I still hear it. That slow dragging on the roof. That dry, broken laugh. And I know she's out there somewhere, waiting for someone else to find that cabin. Back in the fall of 2019, just a few months after I turned 34, I rented a small off-grid cabin deep in the San Juan Mountains of southwest Colorado. My job had worn me down. IT support in Denver, grinding away at deadlines and surrounded by constant noise. I had been stuck in a loop of sleepless nights, cold takeout, and emails that never ended. I was burned out and desperate to get away from everything. So I decided to take a week off, pack my gear, and head into the quiet. Just me and my dog, Milo, a 5-year-old yellow lab who had more energy than most people I knew. The cabin wasn't listed on any big rental site. A guy I'd met at a local hiking group had told me about it. Said it was old but safe. No plumbing, no electricity, no cell service. With stove, a hand pump for water out back, and miles of wilderness on every side. I paid cash in advance, signed some basic papers, and was handed an old metal key that felt like it hadn't been used in decades. I left early on a Tuesday morning in late September. The drive took over 6 hours. Most of it was fine, paved road, but the last 2 hours were slow and rough. My truck rocked and rattled as we climbed a narrow dirt trail winding into the mountains. Trees grew thicker, and the road narrowed so much at times that the branches scratched against the sides of the truck. I had to stop twice to move fallen limbs. Eventually, I reached a small clearing where the cabin sat, tucked into the base of a ridge and surrounded by aspen and spruce. The place looked straight out of a forgotten postcard. Rough timber walls, a sagging tin roof, and a small stone chimney. The The front steps creaked under my weight, and the key stuck hard in the old lock. Inside, it smelled like dust, pine, and old wood smoke. There was a single room with a cot, a table, 2 chairs, and some shelves. A cast iron stove sat in the corner. The floor was uneven, and the windows were dusty but intact. Nothing fancy, but it felt solid and quiet. Exactly what I needed. Milo ran circles around the clearing, tail wagging, nose to the ground. He'd never had this much space to run free. I unpacked slowly, keeping the essentials close. Sleeping bag, lanterns, food, first aid, and a rifle I brought more out of habit than fear. The sun dropped fast behind the ridge. By 6:30, the temperature dipped below 50. I started a fire in the stove, boiled some water for a quick meal, and set up my bed on the cot. The first night was still. I sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars blink into view through the tree canopy. Milo lay beside me, breathing slow and steady. No traffic, no hum of power lines. Just the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. I slept harder than I had in months. By the second day, I felt better already. I hiked a few short trails near the cabin, just exploring. Milo stayed close, sniffing everything, occasionally running ahead, then circling back. We crossed 2 creeks, found an old stone wall that looked like it had been part of a foundation, and even spotted some deer tracks near a dried-up stream bed. I didn't see another soul, no hikers, no hunters, just trees, rock, and silence. It was perfect. That night, something changed. Started with Milo. Around midnight, he woke me up with a low growl. Not playful, serious, focused. I sat up in the dark, heart already racing. The fire had gone out, and the inside of the cabin was pitch black. Milo stood stiff, facing the door, ears up, tail low. I couldn't hear anything at first, just the wind outside. But then faint crunching, like someone stepping on dry twigs. Not close, not right outside, but near enough. I held my breath and listened. It stopped, then started again. A slow, dragging rhythm. Not a deer, not fast enough. Something moving just beyond the tree line. I reached for my flashlight and the rifle, eased off the cot, and crouched low by the window. The beam cut through the dark, catching just trees and brush. Nothing. I didn't open the door, didn't even move toward it. I just waited, listening. The steps faded slowly, not into the distance, but around the side of the cabin. Then nothing. Milo didn't lie down for a long time. The next morning, I walked the area with him. We circled the cabin twice, checking for signs of anything. Prints, broken branches, anything out of place. The ground was dry and covered with pine needles. Nothing obvious, but Milo kept sniffing one patch near the back, by the water pump. He whined and pawed at the dirt, then backed away, tail between his legs. I didn't like that. Still, I told myself it was probably just an animal, elk maybe, or a bear passing through. We were deep enough in the woods. It made sense, but I stayed closer to the cabin that day. Built up the firewood pile, cleaned out the stove, did small maintenance. Milo never went more than a few yards from me. That night, I made sure to lock the door tight and pushed one of the chairs under the handle for good measure. I kept the rifle loaded and beside my cot. The sound came back, just past 1 a.m., same slow steps. Same pattern, crunch, drag, pause. Closer this time. I didn't move, just lay still, holding my breath, hand on the stock of the rifle. Milo didn't growl this time. He just stared at the door, silent, ears flat. The steps stopped directly behind the cabin. Then a new sound, tapping. Soft, irregular, like fingers on wood. Then silence. My skin felt cold even under the blankets. I waited an hour before I dared to move again. When daylight came, I found scratch marks on the back wall of the cabin. Faint but real. They weren't claw marks, they were long and narrow, almost like someone had run a stick or blade along the wood, slow and deliberate. Milo didn't even want to go near that side of the cabin. He barked once and then ran back to the porch. That was the day I started thinking about leaving early, but the road out was rough, and the thought of trying to drive it at night didn't feel safe. I figured I'd stay one more day, keep a fire going, keep watch, then head out in the morning. I didn't hike that day. I stayed inside. Milo curled up near the stove, eyes on the door. I double-checked all the windows, resecured the lock, and brought my truck a little closer to the front of the cabin, just in case. It started raining that evening. Light at first, then harder. The wind picked up, and tree limbs scraped against the cabin roof. I kept the fire hot and the lanterns ready. My nerves were raw. Around midnight, the sound came again, but different. No footsteps this time, just breathing. I know how that sounds, but it's what I heard. Deep, steady, just on the other side of the wall, like someone standing still, less than 3 feet away in the rain. No movement, just breathing. I froze. Then came the knock. One knock, right at the window beside the cot. Not loud, soft, almost like a test. A second passed. Then another knock, slower. I didn't move, didn't speak. Milo stood up, growling now, hair up, eyes wide. Then came the sound of something brushing along the window. Not tapping, not scratching, more like a hand being slowly dragged across the glass. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. When the sky finally turned gray and the rain slowed, I packed everything I could in less than 10 minutes. I loaded Milo into the truck, locked the cabin behind me, and drove out faster than I should have, bouncing hard over the ruts and rocks. I didn't stop until I hit pavement hours later. I never reported anything, never called the guy I rented from. I didn't want to explain scratches, knocks, or why my dog refused to go near that cabin again. I just didn't want to think about it. But weeks later, back in Denver, I was going through my phone, flipping through photos I'd taken before things got weird. Mostly trees, rivers, Milo playing in the brush. But one picture caught me. It was a shot of the cabin from the trail, just before I reached it that first day. A wide frame, the cabin small in the middle, trees all around. But in the shadow under the porch by the front step, there was a shape. Faint, almost easy to miss. A figure low to the ground. Not standing, crouching. No features, just shape. I deleted the photo and never went back. I still camp, still hike, but never that deep, never that far, and never again alone with Milo. Because whatever was out there that night wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a ghost. It was real, and it knew we were alone. It was September of 2014 when I took time off work. I was 33 then, working as a mechanic at a truck repair shop in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Things had been getting to me. Long hours, noisy coworkers, customers that never said thank you. I'd saved up enough leave time, so I told my boss I needed a week off, maybe more. No one argued. I think they could tell I wasn't in the mood for questions. I had access to an old hunting cabin my uncle passed down to me a few years earlier. He'd been a loner most of his life, never married, no kids, just a quiet guy who liked the woods. The cabin sat in northern Arkansas, about 4 hours away from Tulsa. It wasn't much, just a one-room setup with a wood stove, a small table, an old bed frame, and a shed out back with a generator. No plumbing, no cell signal, no neighbors. Exactly what I needed. I left Tulsa early on a Wednesday morning. The skies were overcast, and the roads were quiet. I packed my old truck with a cooler full of food, some canned goods, a few gallons of drinking water, and my .30-06 rifle just in case I wanted to hunt a little. I also brought a few tools, a small solar battery, and enough firewood to last several nights. I didn't plan on going back into town once I got out there. I wanted quiet, total quiet. By the time I reached the old dirt road that led up to the property, it was past 3 p.m. The road was barely visible. Grass and brush had grown over most of it, and the deeper I drove into the woods, the more it felt like I was leaving the rest of the world behind. I drove slow to avoid hitting any rocks or branches. My tires cracked over dry sticks, and the forest got thicker on both sides. After another 10 minutes, I finally saw the cabin through the trees. It looked just like I remembered. Weathered pine boards, sagging roof, tin chimney leaning a little to the right. There were a few broken shingles lying in the weeds near the steps. I parked beside it, turned off the truck, and got out. It was dead quiet, not even birds chirping, just the creak of the trees swaying in the wind. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and took a deep breath. The air was stale. Dust hung in the light from the window. Everything was how I left it last time. A few paperbacks on the shelf, a folded-up blanket on the bed, a can of bug spray on the table. I swept the floor, cleared out a few spider webs, and opened the windows to let some air through. The place came alive a little after that. Started to feel like mine again. That first night, I ate cold beans straight out of the can and drank a bottle of beer while the crickets came alive outside. I sat on the old porch in a folding chair, rifle leaning against the railing, and just stared out at the black woods. No light but the stars above. I couldn't remember the last time I felt that peaceful. I went to bed around 10, the kind of tired that hits when your body finally realizes it can rest. I woke up the next morning around 6. My body wasn't used to sleeping in total silence. No sirens, no buzzing phones, no traffic. Just trees. I had a light breakfast and hiked down to the stream about a half-mile from the cabin. There was a deer trail that cut through the brush, and I followed it, rifle slung over my shoulder. I didn't see anything but squirrels and a few tracks that looked like raccoons or maybe a fox. That second night, I built a small fire in the pit outside. I roasted a hot dog on a stick and sat on a log while it cooked. It had rained a little in the afternoon, so the woods smelled rich and earthy. After it got dark, I sat there for a long while, just listening. The fire cracked and popped beside me. I thought I heard footsteps at one point, but when I turned and looked, it was just a branch falling from one of the trees behind me. I told myself not to get spooked. It's easy to imagine things when you're all alone. Your mind starts filling in blanks with noise and shapes that aren't really there. I went back inside around 9, locked the door, and went to bed. The next few days passed slow, just the way I wanted. I read old magazines I'd left behind years ago, cleaned the shotgun, and cooked simple meals on the camp stove. The weather stayed overcast, and it rained once or twice, just enough to keep the air cool. I hiked a bit, checked for game, never saw anything big enough to shoot. I didn't mind. I wasn't really there to hunt anyway. But by the 5th day, something started to feel off. It was small at first. I noticed a torn piece of my tarp lying near the edge of the woods. I had it tied over my firewood stack behind the cabin, and it looked like someone or something had cut a corner off. The rip was too clean to be a branch or an animal. It looked like it was sliced with something sharp. I checked around but didn't see any boot prints or signs of animals. I figured maybe it got snagged on a nail or torn in the wind. But that night, when I went to check the shed where I kept the generator, the padlock was undone. That stopped me cold. I always lock that shed, even during the day. The generator inside wasn't anything special, but it was worth enough that someone might try to take it. I stepped inside and looked around. Everything seemed untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in there. I checked the gas can, and the level looked slightly lower than I remembered. Not by much, maybe half a cup, but enough that it bothered me. I went back to the cabin and got the rifle. I stood on the porch for a long time, just watching the tree line. The woods didn't make a sound, not even wind. I didn't sleep much that night, Every small creak and rustle set me on edge. I kept the rifle beside me in bed and stared at the ceiling until the sky started to lighten. By the sixth day, I was feeling different about the whole trip. The peace I'd come for was gone. I still hadn't seen anyone out there, but something wasn't right. I decided I'd leave the next morning. I started packing some things up, cleaned the dishes, folded the blankets, and moved a few supplies back into the truck. That evening, I stayed inside after dark. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I ate a cold dinner and kept the lamp off. I sat in the dark cabin, just listening. And then I heard the crunch. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the gravel near the side of the cabin. I froze. They weren't animal footsteps. I knew the sound of boots on gravel. I grabbed the rifle and moved to the window. The glass was dirty, so I had to lean close. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I saw movement between the trees, just a glimpse, maybe 20 feet back in the brush. A man, tall, lean, wearing a dark jacket. He stood still for a moment, and I couldn't see his face. Then he turned and walked deeper into the woods, slow, like he wasn't in a hurry at all. I waited. I stood there for nearly an hour, trying to decide if I should chase him, shout, shoot a warning shot. But I didn't. Something told me not to. Eventually, I sat down in the corner with my back against the wall and kept the rifle aimed at the door until the sun came up. The next morning, I didn't even eat. I packed the rest of my gear, threw the rest of the firewood into the truck bed, and got the hell out of there. I didn't bother locking the cabin. I didn't want to waste a second. I drove fast down the dirt road, faster than I should have, tires slipping in the wet grass. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. When I got back to Tulsa, I didn't tell anyone much. Just said the trip was quiet and peaceful. I didn't go back to that cabin for 2 more years. When I finally did, I brought a friend with me, another hunter I trusted. We stayed 3 nights. Nothing strange happened, but I noticed one thing that stuck with me. The generator gas can was empty, the tarp was missing, and the cabin's lock had been replaced with a new one I didn't recognize. I never found out who it was. A squatter? A local? Someone who'd been using the cabin without me knowing? All I know is this. Someone else had been out there with me that week, watching me maybe longer than I knew, and they didn't want me to stay. It was October of 2018 when I took the trip. I was 34 at the time, living in Fort Collins, Colorado. Things were tense in my life. I had just left a draining job I'd held for 9 years. I'd broken up with someone I'd been living with for nearly 2. Everything felt loud and constant. I needed a break, something far from traffic, far from people, far from cities. I found a listing online. A tiny cabin outside Blanding, Utah, not far from the Abajo Mountains. It looked rough, no frills, no electricity, no running water, just a generator for lights and a propane stove. It was cheap and in the middle of nowhere. The description warned it was isolated, difficult to access, and to bring everything you might need, especially if weather turned. That sounded perfect. I packed my truck with supplies. Extra fuel, a jerry can of water, freeze-dried food, batteries, a heavy-duty flashlight, solar charger, sleeping bag, my hiking gear, and a Remington 870 shotgun I usually kept stored away. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I'd heard enough stories about mountain lions and stray dogs in the area, just in case. I arrived in Blanding just before sunset on a Tuesday. I topped off the gas tank, bought a second can of water, and checked my phone. No reception. The paved road turned into packed dirt, then into what felt like nothing more than a rough trail. It took me over an hour to cover the last 7 miles to the cabin. By the time I saw the structure through the thinning trees, it was already dark. The cabin sat in a slight clearing. It was just one room, with a porch out front and a steel chimney poking up through the roof. A dry shed stood about 15 feet off to the right, leaning slightly from age. The area around it was rough: juniper trees, scrub brush, boulders, and dry grass. No power lines, no nearby homes, no tire tracks except the ones I left. I parked beside it and got out. The air was cold and dry. There was no wind, just stillness. Inside, the place was bare bones. A cot, a small wooden table, 2 old chairs, and a propane heater bolted into the corner. A few shelves held candles, matchbooks, and basic cookware. There was a lock on the inside of the door, but not outside. I unpacked what I needed, set up my sleeping bag on the cot, then stepped outside to listen. It was dead quiet.
No bugs, no birds.
I stood there for a long time before going in and locking the door. That first night, I barely slept. It wasn't because of noise. It was the silence, the complete, unnatural stillness of it. Back home, even when you're out in the woods, there's usually something. An owl, crickets, something. But out here, it was like sound had been turned off, like the world had stopped. I finally drifted off after midnight, woke up at dawn, and spent the next few days reading, walking around the area, taking photos of the landscape, and trying to just let things go. I didn't see another soul. No planes overhead. No signs of anyone passing through in a long time. The place had a weight to it, old, undisturbed. By the 4th day, I started to feel different, like something was watching me. Not constantly, just small moments when I'd step out in the morning or walk out to the outhouse at night. I'd feel it on the back of my neck. I'd stop, look around, but there was never anything. I tried to explain it away. Isolation can play with your mind. I wasn't used to being alone for days with no contact, but I started to notice little things. A half-smoked cigarette stub near the shed that wasn't mine. A pile of animal bones that hadn't been there 2 days before. Scratches on the outer wall I didn't remember seeing when I arrived. That night, I barely slept again. I kept hearing small sounds outside. Nothing loud, just little things, soft crunches in the dirt, maybe branches snapping lightly. The kind of sounds you want to ignore but can't. I stayed in my sleeping bag, shotgun beside me. Every time I started to doze off, another noise would jolt me back awake. In the morning, I walked the perimeter. I didn't find anything out of place until I got behind the cabin. In the dirt beneath a window, I saw prints. They weren't boot tracks. They weren't animal either. Bare feet, human, at least 2 different sets. The heel impressions were deep, like they were walking slowly, almost tiptoeing. I didn't see those the day before. That shook me. I couldn't pretend it was nothing anymore. Someone had been outside while I slept, close enough to peer in. I spent the day on alert, shotgun within reach. I kept the generator off, kept quiet, and avoided walking out of view. When it got dark, I locked the door, dragged one of the chairs under the knob, and sat there for hours, ears straining. Around 2 a.m., I heard them, soft steps in the dirt outside. Then a long dragging sound, like someone pulling a stick across the porch. Then it stopped. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After a long pause, I heard what I can only describe as a sound mimicking a coyote's howl, but off, too slow, too long, like someone trying to imitate it but not knowing how. It echoed through the trees and stopped mid-note. Then silence again. I sat there until dawn, not moving once. When light came, I went out. There were new prints, more distinct this time. Someone barefoot had stood on the porch. Then I noticed the shed door was wide open. I hadn't opened that since I arrived. Inside, there were tools scattered across the ground, like someone had rummaged through them in a hurry. On the back wall, someone had scratched lines, long vertical gouges in the wood, all the same length, maybe with a nail or blade. Nothing written, just repeated over and over. I shut the door and left it that way. That afternoon, I hiked halfway up the hill behind the cabin, trying to get a signal. Still nothing. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but I also didn't want to drive the trail out at night. It was too narrow and rough. One wrong turn and I'd get stuck. I decided I'd leave at dawn the next day. That night was the worst. It started with the smell. Around 8 p.m., the wind shifted, and this rancid, sweet stink wafted in through the gaps around the door, like something rotting. I looked outside with my flashlight, but the beam only reached the edge of the clearing. Beyond that was darkness. Then the noises started again. Low breathing sounds. Something tapping the outside walls gently. Not constant, just random taps, once on the left, then behind me, then the roof. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the roof itself. I aimed the flashlight up through the window but saw nothing. When I turned it off, I caught a glimpse of something move across the window, just a flash of motion. Tall, fast, hunched low. Gone before I could fully register it. I don't know what it was. I still don't. I sat there until nearly 5 a.m., shotgun on my lap. When the light began creeping in, I grabbed my bag, loaded the truck, and didn't even look back at the cabin. I didn't even bother locking it. The road back was rough, and more than once I thought I'd get stuck, but I made it back to pavement by mid-morning. When I finally got reception, I had no messages, no missed calls, nothing. The world just moved on while I was out there. I didn't report it to police. What would I say? That barefoot people were watching me from the woods, scratching lines into a shed, howling like animals? They'd think I was nuts. I got back to Colorado and never spoke about it for months, but I couldn't shake it. I started reading about similar experiences, stories from Utah, Arizona, New Mexico. The word skinwalker came up a lot. People describing being watched, hearing fake animal calls, seeing figures in the dark that didn't look quite human. But I don't believe in that. What I do believe is that there are people out there who choose to live completely off-grid. Some of them aren't just trying to survive. They're doing things no one wants to understand. I think the people I encountered weren't mythical creatures. I think they were just people who'd gone completely feral, living in caves or canyons, stealing supplies, watching strangers from a distance for fun or out of habit. Maybe even more than that. Whatever they were doing that night, I don't want to know. I sold the shotgun when I got home. I stopped hiking alone. I haven't gone camping since. Sometimes when I think back to that place, I still smell that awful stink, and I still remember the sound of something walking on the roof, slow and barefoot, pacing like it was deciding whether to come in. Didn't, but I think if I had stayed one more night, it might have. It was the summer of 2014. I had just turned 35 a few weeks earlier. Life in Detroit was wearing me down, and I needed a break. Everything felt like it was pressing against me all at once. My job at the auto plant had gotten unbearable. The noise of the city kept me up at night, and my relationship had ended after 5 years. I wasn't looking for peace exactly, just silence. I wanted to hear nothing for once. There was a cabin I remembered from my childhood, about 6 miles outside a small town in the Upper Peninsula called Sturgis Bluff. It wasn't ours, but my Uncle Ben used to take me and my cousins up there when we were kids. The thing was, the cabin had been abandoned even back then. I don't remember anyone ever really owning it. It sat deep in the woods, past an overgrown trail that led through thick maple and pine trees. No road signs, no real path, just forest, and then, if you remembered exactly where to look, a small clearing where the cabin stood like it had been dropped in by accident. I hadn't seen the place in maybe 25 years, but for whatever reason, that's where I felt like going. I packed a bag, filled up the tank, and drove north with nothing but my phone, which barely had service that far up, some canned food, and a .22 pistol I kept for safety. I didn't plan to hunt or anything, I just didn't want to be caught out there with nothing if something came along. I had no real schedule, just an idea to spend a few days alone, maybe hike a little, try to sleep for once. Took a while to find the right path again. I parked my truck off a logging road and walked in on foot. The forest had changed over the years, but not so much that I couldn't find my way. The trail was nearly gone, just a faint depression in the ground. I had to push through saplings and thick underbrush. It was quiet out there, so quiet it almost rang in my ears. When I finally saw the cabin again, it was like looking at a memory in real life. Same structure, small, about the size of a two-car garage. The wood had gone darker over time, soaked by weather. The roof had sagged a little in the middle. One of the shutters had fallen off and was lying in the weeds. But the door was still there, still closed, like it was waiting for someone. I stepped inside and was hit by the thick smell of old wood, dust, and mildew. The floor creaked with every step. There wasn't much inside, just an old table, a chair with a leg missing, and a shelf with a few rusted cans. The back wall still had the old iron stove my uncle used to point out. It hadn't been used in decades. I checked the corners, swept out some of the leaves and dirt, and figured it was good enough for a night or two. I laid out my sleeping bag near the wall opposite the door. I didn't build a fire, didn't want to draw attention or fill the small space with smoke. I just sat there in the silence, watching the trees sway through the open window. The sun started to drop behind the trees around 8:30, and by 9 o'clock, it was black outside. No streetlights, no headlights, nothing. The stars came out and filled the sky. I remember lying down that first night, staring up at the wooden beams above me, and feeling the weight of the silence press down. No city sounds, just the occasional snap of a branch outside or the call of a bird. I slept surprisingly well. The next day, I walked deeper into the woods. I had a compass, but I was careful not to stray too far. I just wanted to walk until I got tired. I found a small creek about a mile out and sat there for a while, watching the water bubble over rocks. Everything felt calm, but there was something strange too. Every now and then I'd get this feeling like I was being watched. Not constantly, just little flashes of it. Like I'd look up too quick and expect to see someone in the trees. But there was never anything there. When I got back to the cabin that afternoon, I noticed something that made my stomach turn a little. My backpack had been moved. It wasn't a big thing, just shifted a foot or two from where I'd left it. I told myself I must have kicked it by accident when I left. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. I checked my food, my flashlight, my knife. Everything was there. Nothing was missing. Still, I decided to set up a small trap before night fell. Nothing fancy, just a can tied to the door handle with fishing line. If the door opened, it'd fall and make a sound. It made me feel a little better. That night was different. Couldn't sleep. There were more noises outside. Twigs snapping, something brushing against the side of the cabin. I told myself it was animals, probably deer, maybe a raccoon. Still, I kept my hand close to the pistol and stared at the door. I think I dozed off around 2 a.m., but I kept waking up every hour. The next morning, I found the can lying on the floor, right where it would have dropped if someone had opened the door. But the door was still closed. Nothing looked disturbed. I stood there staring at it, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it fell from a gust of wind. Maybe the fishing line slipped. I didn't want to think about someone being out there in the dark. I walked the area around the cabin and found boot prints about 20 feet into the trees, leading away from the clearing. They weren't mine. The treads didn't match my boots. I squatted down and looked at them. They were fresh. I could see the edges clearly in the mud. Whoever made them wasn't walking toward the cabin. They were walking away, which meant they'd been there. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I told myself I was overreacting. I still had 2 full days left before I planned to head back. So I stayed, but I didn't walk far that day. I kept my eyes on the woods and my pistol on my hip. I felt exposed. Later that evening, I tried to make some food over a small fire outside. I couldn't keep my hands from shaking. My ears were straining for any sound that didn't belong. At one point, I heard something that sounded like a cough, just a single soft sound, way out in the trees. I froze, waited. Nothing followed. I put the fire out and went inside, locked the door as if that would help. Around midnight, I woke up to a scratching sound on the outside wall of the cabin. Not an animal. It was slow, rhythmic, like someone dragging a stick or a knife along the wood. I didn't move. I just lay there, eyes wide open, breathing shallow. Stopped after a minute, maybe less. I waited another hour before I dared to sit up. I stayed inside the rest of the night. When morning finally came, I stepped outside and walked around the cabin. There were fresh scratches on the wall, long and shallow. I felt cold all over. I didn't know if someone was messing with me or if I was losing my mind. I packed up that morning. I didn't even eat. I just stuffed everything into my bag, tucked the pistol in my jacket, and started walking back toward my truck. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire way. No sounds, no footsteps, just the wind and birds. When I got back to where I had parked, my stomach dropped. The truck's driver's side door was wide open. I never leave it open. I checked inside. Everything was there, but the glove box had been emptied out. My insurance papers, maps, even an old photo I kept of me and my dad. All of it was scattered on the floor. I drove straight out of there. Didn't stop in town. Didn't call anyone. Just drove all the way back to Detroit, barely stopping for gas. For a few weeks, I tried to forget about it. Told myself it was just a squatter or a hunter playing games. But then, one day, I came home and found a boot print in my apartment hallway. Same tread as the one I saw in the woods. I never found out how it got there. My door was locked. Nothing was stolen. But the print was clear, right on the hardwood floor outside my bedroom. After that, I moved, left the city, changed jobs, got a place with cameras and a deadbolt you could see from across the room. I never went back to that cabin, never even tried to find it again. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. I don't think I ever will, but I know someone watched me, not just at the cabin, but maybe even after. And that's something I carry every day now. I don't sleep with the lights off anymore. I don't hike alone. And I sure as hell don't go looking for silence in places the world forgot. Because someone's still there. And maybe they don't forget so easy. I was 32 when I finally took some time off work. I had been grinding nonstop for years at a security company down in Oklahoma City. I didn't take vacations, didn't really hang out with friends, and barely got sleep. When my dad passed away in late 2023, it was like something inside me just shut off for a while. He left me a piece of land in southern Colorado, not far from the New Mexico border. It had a small, rundown cabin on it. Nothing fancy. One room, a tin roof, and a wood stove. No plumbing, no electricity, just a small place in the middle of nowhere. I took the trip in mid-April of 2024. I drove my old Toyota Tacoma up into the mountains, past Trinidad, then kept going until the dirt road narrowed and turned rocky. I had to drive slow after a while, weaving between patches of leftover snow and fallen branches. Eventually, the road became just two narrow tire tracks. By the time I saw the cabin through the trees, the sun had dipped low. It was one of those chilly evenings where the air smells like pine and melting snow. The cabin wasn't much to look at. Weathered wood siding, some moss on the roof, a busted shutter hanging sideways. I parked my truck beside it and stretched. I remember standing there, staring at it, wondering why my dad never told me much about the place. He was a quiet man, and we weren't close the last few years of his life, but this cabin felt like a whole part of him I didn't know. I unpacked my gear, mostly canned food, water jugs, some tools, a solar lantern, a heavy sleeping bag, and a .38 revolver I kept in a lockbox. I wasn't paranoid, but being alone out there, it gave me peace of mind. The first night was calm. I lit a fire in the stove, ate a can of chili, and sat on the old wooden chair by the window. There were no neighbors, no cars, not even the distant buzz of planes, just wind and trees. I kept the lantern low and sat there for an hour before I crawled into the sleeping bag laid out on the cot. I fell asleep listening to wind sliding across the roof. The next morning, I chopped some firewood, cleared out a collapsed shed nearby, and explored a bit around the cabin. There was a half-frozen creek about 200 yards down the hill, and some rusted tools in an old wooden box under the porch. I even found a small trail behind the cabin that looked like it hadn't been walked in decades. I followed it for maybe 20 minutes before it just ended at a mossy boulder. That night, around 2:30 in the morning, I woke up to a sound. It was soft, but it was enough to pull me out of sleep. At first, I thought it was an animal walking on the porch, maybe a raccoon or something. But then I heard the sound again, slow footsteps, not four-legged scrambling. Human steps, just soft thuds on the wooden porch. I stayed still in my sleeping bag, heart thudding. There was no window on the side of the cabin facing the door, so I couldn't see anything unless I moved. I waited, holding my breath, listening. The steps stopped. Then there was silence for what felt like 5 minutes. Then the doorknob clicked. It wasn't loud, just a faint turn, like someone testing it slowly. I grabbed the revolver from the crate next to the cot and held it against my chest. The knob clicked again. Then I heard a light thud, like something being pressed against the door. A minute later, silence again. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night, just stared at the dark ceiling, listening to every crack and creak the place made. When the sun finally came up, I stepped outside with the gun in one hand. The porch looked normal.
No footprints.
But it had rained a bit during the night, so I figured any prints would have been washed away. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe the wood swelled or the wind rattled it. I tried to push it out of my mind. The third day, I hiked a little farther down the trail and found an old barbed wire fence with a fallen, no trespassing sign. On the other side was what looked like the remains of another cabin, or maybe a shack. The wood was black from weather and collapsed in on itself. I didn't cross the fence. Something about it felt off, like I shouldn't be there. When I got back to my place, there was a small pile of rocks stacked on the porch, neatly balanced. 3 stones, small, flat, stacked one on top of the other. I hadn't done that. That night, I barely slept. I sat in the chair with the revolver in my lap, waiting. The wind blew steady through the trees. Around midnight, I thought I heard something walking in the brush behind the cabin, but I never saw anything. I dozed off sometime after 2 a.m. with the fire dying out. In the morning, the rocks were gone. I packed up some gear and decided to hike to the nearest ranger station, which according to the map I had was about 6 miles to the west. I marked the trail with red ribbon as I went, tying pieces to branches every 100 yards so I could find my way back. After nearly 4 hours, I reached the station, just a locked building with no one there. A sign on the door said it wasn't staffed until May. I made my way back slowly, taking breaks along the trail. When I got close to the cabin, maybe 100 yards out, I smelled something, like blood and smoke. I crouched behind a tree and scanned the clearing. The door to the cabin was wide open. I hadn't left it like that. I waited 10 minutes before I stepped into the open, slowly circling the cabin with the gun out. Inside, nothing was touched. Nothing burned, nothing bloody. The smell was gone too, but on the wall above the cot, someone had scratched something into the wood. It was deep and ragged, like someone used a nail or a knife. It just said, "Do not sleep. That night, I stayed awake with my back against the wall, the revolver resting on my knee. I didn't light a fire. I didn't eat. I kept my head on a swivel, listening. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time not just on the porch. I heard them around the back of the cabin, then the side, then front again, pacing, like someone circling the place slowly, over and over. I didn't move. I sat there, silent, for nearly an hour, just listening. Eventually, the sound stopped, but I didn't sleep. I watched the dark till the sky turned pale blue. The next morning, I found a deep scratch on the side of my truck, about 4 feet long, straight through the paint down to the metal. I wanted to leave. I really did, but a part of me didn't want to be chased off. I figured maybe it was a squatter or some mountain hermit trying to scare me, maybe some sick game. I just wanted one more night to catch whoever it was. I even set up a simple tripwire using fishing line and some bells I had in my gear. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the fire out again and sat by the window, watching the edge of the woods with a pair of binoculars. I didn't hear anything for hours. Then the bell rang, softly but clear. Then again. I rushed to the door and pulled it open. Nothing. I scanned the trees with my flashlight. Just pines and shadows. I followed the tripwire. It was still in place, but a single boot print sat in the mud 10 feet from my porch. Just one. No others around it. I looked around until sunrise. Found nothing. I packed everything up, loaded it into the truck, and drove down the mountain without stopping. I made it back to Oklahoma the next night. I parked the truck and didn't touch it for 3 days. When I finally opened the bed to unload my gear, I found something wedged under the tarp. An axe, old, rusted, wooden handle cracked and worn. Not mine. It was sitting on top of my sleeping bag. I took it straight to the police, filed a report, explained everything. They asked if I wanted to press charges, but there was no suspect, no real crime, just a strange story and an old axe. I never went back to that cabin. Sold the land within a month. Didn't care what I got for it. To this day, I don't know who that was. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this much, whoever it was, they didn't want me there. And they were watching me the whole time. Not just from the woods, but close. Too close. And I'll never forget that scratch on the wall. Do not sleep. I didn't sleep right for months. I was 26 the year I decided to get away from the city for a few days. It was the fall of 2019, and life had gotten overwhelming. I'd been working as a delivery driver in Tulsa for a few years by then. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills. Rent, gas, groceries. My dad had passed away a few years back from a stroke. He was only in his early 60s. After he died, I'd stayed close with a few of his old friends, especially one named Walter, who was kind of like an uncle to me. Walter was a retired trucker, lived alone, didn't care for city life, and spent most of his time up north near the Missouri border. He owned a small hunting cabin outside a town called Pine Hollow, deep in the Ozark woods. He used to go up there to fish and sit around and just be alone. He told me once that there wasn't any cell reception. No internet, no neighbors within a mile, just trees and hills and the sound of wind in the leaves. So that October, when I mentioned how stressed out I was, Walter offered the cabin. Said he hadn't been up there in a couple years, but the place was still solid. He even gave me the keys and marked a spot on an old road map where the turnoff was. Some dirt track off Highway 59. Said it might be a little overgrown, but I'd find it. I packed light. A cooler with bottled water, jerky, canned chili, crackers, a flashlight, my old .22 rifle, and a sleeping bag. I brought my dad's hunting knife too, the one with the leather sheath he used to carry. I still kept it sharp. My plan was to drive out, spend 2 nights alone, maybe hike around a bit, and just let my head clear. The drive out of Tulsa took about 4 hours. I stopped once for gas and a sandwich at some country gas station that looked like it hadn't changed since the 80s. By the time I got close to Pine Hollow, the road narrowed and curved like crazy. I had to slow down to 30 in some spots because of all the tight turns. My phone lost signal just past a town called Sturgeon Rock, which I hadn't even seen on the map. From there on, it was just me, the road, and the occasional deer darting across the blacktop. Eventually, I saw the turnoff just like Walter said. A faded wooden sign nailed to a tree, Gander Ridge Trail. I took the turn, eased my old Honda CR-V onto the dirt path, and drove maybe 15 more minutes into the forest. It was quiet out there. So quiet it made me more aware of the creaks in my suspension, the crunch of tires over fallen leaves, the steady hum of my own breathing. The trees leaned in close on both sides, and in some places the branches scratched my side mirrors. There was barely enough room for one vehicle. I remember thinking that if I met someone coming the other way, we'd both be in trouble. The trail ended in a small clearing just big enough for my car to park. In front of me stood the cabin. It was smaller than I'd pictured. One room, tin roof, front porch sagging slightly on the left side. The wood was faded and gray but not rotting. Windows were dusty but unbroken. The padlock on the front door had rusted shut, but I managed to pry it open with a rock. Inside, it smelled like old pine, dry dirt, and faint mildew. I opened the windows to air it out. There was a cot, a steel wood stove, an old cooler, a chipped table with a folding chair, and a stack of yellowed newspapers from 2012. I smiled. It was perfect. I unpacked, set my bag down, and cracked open a water bottle. Outside, the sun was still above the trees, but the shadows were getting longer. I walked around the cabin, inspecting the place. There was an old outhouse about 30 yards into the trees, and a small creek ran maybe 100 yards to the east. Walter had mentioned that creek, said it used to bring raccoons around at night. By dark, I had a small fire going in a ring of stones outside the front door. I sat on a log and ate some jerky and crackers.
No cars, no planes, no sirens, no voices.
Just the crackle of the fire, the wind in the trees, and a few distant owl calls. I felt good, tired, but clear-headed. But that night didn't go quite how I expected. I woke up sometime after midnight. I don't know what woke me. There wasn't any sound, not really, but something felt off. I was in my sleeping bag on the cot, and the fire had burned down to ash. The moonlight lit up the room in a pale gray glow, just enough to make out the window across from me. That's when I saw movement. It was fast, just a flicker of motion across the window. I blinked and sat up. My heart jumped a little, but I told myself it was just a bird or a raccoon. Still, I got up and walked quietly to the window. I didn't see anything at first, just trees and shadows. Then I noticed something strange. The far edge of the clearing, where the woods started again, looked darker than it should have. Like something was standing just inside the tree line, blocking the moonlight. A shape, not moving, not big, but tall. Too tall to be a deer, too narrow to be a bear. I stayed still. My breath got shallow. I didn't have the rifle near me. It was leaning in the corner by the door. The shape didn't move. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just watching. Finally, I told myself again it was just a trick of the trees, and I went back to the cot, though I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I walked to the edge of the clearing where I thought I'd seen the figure. There were no footprints, nothing broken, no snapped twigs, but something felt weird. The undergrowth there was trampled down in a way that didn't match the rest of the forest, almost like someone had been pacing. I spent that day trying to relax. I hiked around the area, found a deer trail, took some photos on my digital camera. I brought the rifle with me just in case. I didn't see any animals. I didn't even hear birds. The silence started to bother me. The air felt heavy. It wasn't just quiet, it was dead quiet. When I got back to the cabin around 5, I noticed something else. There were scuff marks on the porch. Small ones, like someone had walked up to the front steps. But they weren't there the day before. I was sure of that. They weren't deep enough to be boot prints. More like something had been dragged lightly. I checked the door, locked it, checked the windows. All closed. That night, I didn't light a fire. I stayed inside with the rifle across my lap. I sat in the dark, staring at the window, listening. Around 2 a.m., I heard the first noise. A soft crunch outside, like someone stepping on leaves slowly. I held my breath. Then another step. Closer. It stopped. I waited. Then it started again, moving along the side of the cabin, toward the back. I stood up, rifle in hand, and crept to the back window. I didn't see anything, but I felt like something was just out of view, waiting. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care if I had another night planned. Something was out there. Someone. When I stepped outside, the first thing I saw was a pile of rocks in the middle of the clearing. It hadn't been there the day before. 6 smooth stones, stacked like a small cairn. Nothing else disturbed. It made my skin crawl. I loaded the car in 10 minutes and got out fast. On the way back down the dirt trail, I had to stop twice to move branches that had fallen across the road. I didn't remember them being there before. One of them looked like it had been freshly cut. When I finally reached the highway, I didn't stop driving until I was halfway back to Tulsa. I didn't tell Walter everything when I returned his key. Just thanked him and said it was a little too quiet for me. A week later, I looked up the area on an old topographical map. I found a note scribbled in the margin near Gander Ridge. Abandoned mine shaft. Collapse in '94. About a mile from where the cabin was. I don't know if someone still lives near there, or camps, or watches, but I know what I saw, and I know the feeling I had wasn't just paranoia. Something or someone was out there, and they knew I was there too. I never went back. It was late October 2013. I was 34 then, single, living in Bozeman, Montana. I'd been working construction for the past decade, mostly roofing and framing. The hours were long and the work was tough, but I liked being outside. I didn't care much for people or noise, so when I wasn't on a job, I stayed far from town. That year, I had taken on fewer contracts and started spending more time alone, mostly in the forest north of Canyon Ferry Lake. I'd found a quiet patch of land about 3 miles off a forgotten logging road. It wasn't mine, just forest land, but no one had touched it in years. You had to walk in because the road was so washed out, most trucks couldn't make it through. That patch of woods had been in the back of my mind for a while. I had scouted it the previous spring and cleared a little space not far from a slow creek. It was tucked in behind a steep slope and surrounded by thick pine and some rocky outcrops. You couldn't see it from any road, not even with binoculars. I wanted to build something simple, just a small one-room cabin with 4 walls, a slanted roof, and a wood stove. No plumbing, no electricity, just a place to disappear to sometimes. That October weekend, I decided to finally start building. The forecast said rain, maybe even sleet at night, but I didn't care. I packed my gear. Tarp, hatchet, folding saw, hammer, nails, camp stove, tools, my old .30-30 lever rifle, some canned food, a sleeping bag, and a small tent just in case I didn't finish the structure. I loaded everything onto a gear sled, strapped it to my back, and hiked in early Friday morning. It took nearly 3 hours to reach the spot, and I was soaked in sweat by the time I dropped the sled. The sky was already clouded over, and the air smelled wet, like the kind of rain that hangs low and doesn't stop for days. I worked quickly, laying down a makeshift foundation of flat stone and logs. The area was uneven, so I spent most of Friday just leveling out the space and cutting support beams from deadfall. The rain started mid-afternoon, a cold drizzle that seeped through my jacket and made everything slick. By nightfall, I'd only gotten 2 walls framed. I threw a tarp over the beams and set up my tent nearby. The ground was soaked, and my clothes were damp through. I made a small fire under the tarp and warmed a can of chili, then crawled into my sleeping bag with my rifle at my side, listening to the soft drum of rain on nylon. The next morning was worse. The rain hadn't let up, and fog had rolled in, thick as smoke. The forest felt tight, like it was pressing in on me. I kept working, though. I wasn't new to bad weather. I'd worked on rooftops during sleet storms and once helped frame a house while the wind tore scaffolding off the sides. Rain was nothing new. Still, something about that place, maybe the quiet, maybe the thick woods, was getting under my skin. By noon, I had 3 full walls up and the frame for the roof laid out. The ground was getting muddy, and everything took twice as long. I slipped once while hammering a rafter and gashed my palm on a rusty nail sticking out of a fallen beam. I wrapped it with duct tape and kept going. Then around 3, I noticed something strange. About 50 yards up the slope behind the cabin, the trees thinned for a bit. That area had always looked uneven, like something had torn through there a long time ago. I had never thought much of it until I saw something dark up there. At first I thought it was a burnt tree stump or a rock, but as I kept glancing back at it, it seemed out of place. It didn't move, but it didn't look like part of the woods either. I squinted at it for a few minutes, then went back to work, figuring it was just my eyes playing tricks. I worked until sundown, got the roof half done, and nailed the 4th wall in place. It was nothing fancy, no windows, just a small door frame and a few air gaps between planks. But it was shelter. I didn't bother with the tent that night. I laid my sleeping bag inside the unfinished cabin, threw the tarp over the missing roof section, and used my small camp stove for heat. That night was the worst. The rain got heavier, pounding down like gravel on the tarp. Wind pushed through the gaps in the walls and made the whole place creak. I barely slept. Every little sound outside made me freeze. A branch snapping, leaves rustling, something splashing in the creek nearby. Around 2 a.m., I sat up and listened hard. There was something moving outside. Not an animal, at least not any I knew. It was slow, deliberate. Wet footsteps, not shuffling like a deer, not light like a raccoon. Just slow, steady steps in the mud. I stayed still for maybe 10 minutes, holding my rifle across my chest. I couldn't see a thing through the cracks in the wall. It was too dark and the rain was too loud. The steps circled around the back of the cabin, stopped near the left side wall. Then nothing. I waited. Nothing. Not a sound. I stayed awake the rest of the night, never hearing it walk away. When dawn came, the rain finally let up. It was still gray and wet, but quiet. I got up stiff and sore, my neck aching from the cold. I stepped outside with the rifle and looked around. The mud around the cabin was thick and chewed up from my boots. I didn't see anything unusual until I walked around the back. That's when I found it. Near the back wall, just a few feet from where I slept, were clear tracks. Bare feet. Human.
Nos shoes.
Just long, wide, bare feet with deep impressions in the mud. They came down from the slope, circled the cabin, and then stopped near the wall. There were no exit tracks. I looked up the hill, heart pounding. The woods were silent. I scanned the slope, looking for movement, but saw nothing. I followed the prints a few feet before they vanished in the brush. My boots sank in the wet ground, and the cold shot through my legs. I didn't go far. I just turned and went back to the cabin.
I packade fast.
Tossed everything back into the sled, covered the tools with the tarp, and hiked out before noon. The air felt wrong, like I wasn't alone. I didn't stop for water. I didn't rest. I made it back to my truck soaked, exhausted, and uneasy. Back in Bozeman, I spent the rest of the weekend indoors. I didn't tell anyone. What was I going to say? That I'd been watched in the woods? That someone barefoot had walked around my cabin in the middle of a rainstorm and then vanished? People would think I was paranoid, or worse. I barely slept for the next week. I didn't go back that year, or the next. It wasn't until 2 summers later that I finally hiked back in. I told myself it was stupid to leave tools out there. I told myself I'd imagine the tracks. Maybe they'd been mine or old prints filled with water. Maybe I dreamed it. I waited for a hot, dry stretch in July and went in during daylight. The cabin was still there, though the roof had caved in slightly on one side. The wood had grayed, but the structure was solid. I checked around and didn't see any signs of people. No garbage, no fire pits, no broken branches. It was like no one had touched it since I left. Except for one thing. Nailed to the inside of the front wall above the doorway was a piece of bone. Maybe from a deer or elk. It was stripped clean, tied with twine, and pinned into the wood. I never put it there. I left that day and never went back again. I've built dozens of cabins since then. Some deep in the woods, some up in the mountains. I've camped in storms, gotten lost in snow, even had bears circle my camp. But that cabin off the old logging road near Canyon Ferry? I won't step foot near it. Some places just don't want you there. And sometimes, if you don't listen, they show you why. It was the summer of 2019 when I took the ranger job in Bitterroot Valley, Montana. I was 31, single, and tired of city life. I'd been working in warehouse logistics back in Kansas City, and the noise, the traffic, and the constant rush had gotten to me. I saw a listing online for a seasonal ranger assistant in the Forest Department. Lodging included, mostly solo work, deep in the woods. I applied, thinking I wouldn't hear back. But 3 weeks later, I was packing my truck and heading west. The ranger station was a small wooden building tucked away near the edge of a lake. Crescent Lake, they called it. No phone service, no Wi-Fi, but I didn't mind. They gave me an old cabin about a 15-minute drive uphill from the main station. It was quiet up there. No other cabins around, just trees, wildlife, and the soft sound of wind moving through pine needles. The cabin was built decades ago, a little run down but still strong. It had 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, and a front porch that faced east. Every morning I'd sit there with a thermos of coffee, watching the sun climb up behind the ridge. No traffic, no yelling neighbors, just me and the forest. The job wasn't hard. I kept hiking trails clear, cleaned up after careless campers, and reported anything unusual to the head ranger, a guy named Mark who lived closer to town. We rarely saw each other in person, just radio calls and the occasional supply run. Most days were uneventful. The woods stayed calm and people mostly followed the rules. Some teenagers left beer cans near a fire pit one weekend, and once a hunter shot a deer in a restricted zone, but nothing crazy. That changed the second week of August. Started small. I was doing a routine sweep on Trail 7, one of the longer, less used paths that looped around the north side of the lake. I found a backpack lying in the middle of the trail. It looked fairly new, but dirty. Mud caked around the zippers and straps. I looked inside. There was a water bottle, some trail mix, and a map. No ID. The odd thing was the water bottle was still cold, which meant whoever dropped it couldn't have been far off. I called it in to Mark on the radio. He told me to leave a note and return it to the lost and found bin at the main station. I did what he said, but something about it stuck with me. The next day, I found a torn flannel shirt tangled in a bush not far from the same trail. Looked like someone had yanked it off in a hurry. No blood, no signs of a struggle, just the shirt caught up in thorns. That night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept hearing odd sounds outside the cabin. Quick footsteps, like someone pacing along the gravel. I got up twice and went to the porch with my flashlight. Nothing, just trees and the sound of wind. No animals I could see, not even a deer. But the feeling that someone had been close, watching, maybe didn't leave. 2 days later, things got worse. I was heading up the service road in my truck around noon. It had rained the night before, so the ground was soft, and you could see tire tracks clearly. Halfway up, I noticed deep tread marks pulling off the side of the road, disappearing into the trees. I stopped the truck, got out, and followed them. They led to a small clearing I didn't even know existed. A perfect circle of flattened grass, like someone had camped there. In the center was a fire pit, still warm. Around it were footprints, too many for one person. I counted at least 3 different sets of prints, all adult-sized, some barefoot, some wearing boots. And near the fire was something I still can't explain. A pile of cigarette butts, at least 40 or 50, stacked neatly in a circle, like someone had sat there chain-smoking all night but kept every butt in a perfect ring. That wasn't normal. I've seen campers smoke, sure, but no one does that. It was too deliberate, too careful. I snapped a few pictures with my phone. Later, when I looked back at them, I noticed something strange. In the background of one, between 2 trees, there was a figure, faint, blurry, like someone had been standing just far enough away to avoid being seen. I didn't mention it to Mark. Not yet. I didn't want to sound paranoid. That night, I locked the door of my cabin. I checked every window twice and left the porch light on. I even placed a hatchet by the side of my bed. I felt stupid doing it, but the sense of being watched had grown heavier every day. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up to a metallic sound. Not loud, more like a slow creak, like rusted hinges moving. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The sound came again. Creak, then a soft thud. It wasn't coming from inside. It was just outside, near the shed where I kept the gas cans and tools. I got up, slipped on my boots, and grabbed the flashlight. When I opened the cabin door, the air was cold and still. Too still. No crickets, no wind. I walked quietly to the shed. The door was wide open. That door had a padlock on it. I knew because I locked it every night. I swept the flashlight inside. Tools scattered. A shovel lying across the ground. 1 gas can missing. I backed away slowly. My hand was shaking. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I told Mark everything. He said he'd send a ranger up the next afternoon. Told me to stay armed and be careful. I took a hike after lunch to clear my head. I went west of the cabin, where a steep ridge gave a good view of the valley. As I stood there, I saw movement down near the treeline. A flash of red. I raised my binoculars. There was a man standing in the open. Long dark hair, no shirt, just jeans and no shoes. He was staring straight up at me. No expression, just watching. I lowered the binoculars for a second. When I raised them again, he was gone. I rushed back to the cabin, locked every door and window, and waited. Around sunset, I heard footsteps again. This time they were slow, heavy, walking around the cabin, not trying to be quiet. They circled the place twice, then stopped near the back wall. I didn't dare look out the window. In the morning, I found muddy footprints, barefoot, leading from the back wall all the way to the porch and then back into the woods. When the other ranger arrived that afternoon, I told him everything. He looked shaken. We searched the area together, but the tracks had dried or disappeared. That night, he stayed in the cabin with me. We took shifts staying awake. At 2 a.m., he nudged me awake and whispered, "Someone's outside." We listened. There was something scraping against the outer wall. Slow, steady, like metal on wood. Then nothing. Silence. In the morning, we found 5 deep scratch marks on the side of the cabin, carved straight through the outer paneling. Clean, deliberate. The head ranger ordered a full search of the area. They brought in dogs, more rangers, even drones. They found the missing gas can in a cave 2 miles out, along with a pile of old clothes, plastic wrappers, and torn-up shoes. Looked like someone had been living out there for months. But the man? No trace. I left the job early. I couldn't sleep in that cabin anymore. Even now, years later, I still wake up some nights and feel like someone's standing just outside my window. They never found out who he was. No ID. No recent missing persons matching the description. Just a man in the woods watching, following, never speaking. Sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't a ghost or a monster. Sometimes it's just someone who's decided to disappear and doesn't want to be alone. It was late September of 2013 when I decided to take some time off and spend a few days out in the countryside, away from everything. I had been working as a mechanic in Lubbock, Texas, for over a decade. The heat, the noise, the smell of oil and rubber. I needed a break from all of it. I wasn't married, didn't have kids, and most of my friends had either moved away or gotten too busy with their own lives. I needed some quiet. I needed to feel like I could breathe again. I found this old listing online. A small one-room wooden cabin sitting at the edge of a forgotten cemetery out near a little place called Turkey, Texas. The cabin was owned by some guy who used to be a caretaker for the graveyard decades ago. According to the listing, it hadn't been used in years but was still solid and perfect for hunters or those wanting isolation. I wasn't going hunting, but I sure wanted isolation. The cemetery itself was tucked away on some forgotten land, surrounded by barbed wire fencing, mesquite trees, and flat, dry dirt that stretched on in every direction. There was no town nearby, just one long dirt road that curved and disappeared into the horizon. I packed up my old Ford F-150 with water, food, a sleeping bag, tools, and a few other essentials, and I made the 3-hour drive northeast. I got there late in the afternoon. The sky was bright and clear. The wind was hot and dry, and the air smelled like dust and sagebrush. I followed the directions exactly. Down an old ranch road that split off from the main highway, then through a rusty gate with a bent "No Trespassing" sign half buried in the grass. I could barely see the cabin from the road. It was half hidden behind a row of overgrown bushes and a sagging oak tree. When I parked and stepped out, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, dead quiet. No birds, no crickets, no wind through the trees. Just stillness. The kind that feels unnatural after you've been living in a place full of noise. I told myself that was what I wanted, no people, no sounds. But now that I had it, it felt strange. The cabin was smaller than I expected. It looked like it had been built in the 1960s or earlier. The wood was gray and cracked in places. The door creaked when I opened it, and the hinges felt like they were one hard pull away from snapping off. Inside, there was only one room, a cot, an old iron stove, a broken-down table with one chair, and a narrow shelf with a few rusted pots and pans. The windows were covered with wire mesh and didn't have glass. I unpacked my things and walked around the property. Behind the cabin, maybe 40 yards away, was the cemetery. The fence around it was broken in several places, and most of the tombstones had sunk into the earth or tilted at odd angles. Some of them were so worn you couldn't read the names. Others still had faint lettering, people who had died in the 1800s, mostly. It looked abandoned, like no one had been buried there in decades. I set up my sleeping bag inside the cabin and made a small fire in the stove using what I brought in the truck. That first night passed quietly. I heard coyotes yipping somewhere far off, but nothing close. No lights in the sky, no people, no movement. I slept surprisingly well. The second day, I spent a lot of time outside. I walked the edges of the property, checked out the fences, and even poked around the cemetery a bit. There was something strange about the place. Not anything spooky, just odd. The ground felt uneven, like the whole place had been slowly sinking. Some headstones had fallen forward, almost swallowed by the dry earth, and I kept finding little animal bones here and there, as if a fox or bobcat had been dragging kills into the area to feed. That evening, I made a small fire pit outside using some flat rocks I found behind the cabin. I cooked a can of beans and sat in the dirt, watching the sun drop behind the trees. The shadows stretched out slowly, and the tombstones faded into darkness one by one. I stayed out there until it got chilly, then headed inside. Sometime around midnight, I woke up to a sound. It was faint, but enough to pull me out of a deep sleep. It sounded like someone stepping on dry grass just outside the cabin. My body went still. I didn't move or breathe for a few seconds. I told myself it was probably an armadillo or a raccoon, but then I heard it again. Slow steps, heavy enough to sound like a person. The kind of steps that pause every few seconds, like someone listening. I reached for the small flashlight next to my sleeping bag and pointed it toward the window. I couldn't see anything through the mesh. I held my breath and waited. The steps circled once around the cabin and then stopped. Nothing for the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked the area around the cabin. There were no footprints, but the dry ground didn't show much of anything. A few broken branches, maybe, but nothing clear. I tried not to overthink it. The third day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I didn't feel like walking out to the cemetery again. I sat under the old oak tree with a book, trying to relax, but I couldn't stop glancing toward the tombstones. The quiet that I had wanted so badly was now starting to feel heavy, almost like pressure building around me. Every little sound made me tense up. That evening, just before dark, I spotted something strange near the back of the cemetery fence. It looked like a small wooden door set into the ground. I hadn't seen it the day before. It was half covered with grass and dirt. I walked over and cleared it off. It was about 3 feet wide, maybe 4 feet long, and made from thick old planks with a rusted latch. It didn't look like a grave, more like a storm shelter or maybe a root cellar. The handle was rusted solid. I tugged at it, but it didn't budge. Something about it made me uneasy, so I backed off and went inside. That night, the footsteps came back. They were slower this time, closer. I could hear them pause right outside the door. Then a soft scrape, like someone brushing their hand or a stick along the wall. I gripped the flashlight and sat up, heart pounding. I didn't move for over an hour. Eventually, the noise stopped. When the sun came up, I walked around the cabin again. No tracks, no signs of anything. I checked the door to make sure it hadn't been tampered with, but everything was exactly the same. Still, I decided that was enough. I had brought enough supplies for 5 days, but I didn't want to stay another night. I started packing up, folding my sleeping bag, gathering trash, but I couldn't stop thinking about that wooden hatch in the cemetery. Something about it felt wrong, out of place, like it didn't belong with the rest of the graves. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my crowbar from the truck and went back out to it. I pried at the latch until it finally gave way. The door creaked open, revealing a dark hole in the ground. The smell hit me first, wet dirt, mold, and something else. Something foul. I aimed my flashlight down and saw a narrow stairway made of crumbling stone steps. The walls were lined with wooden beams. It looked like a tiny underground chamber. I didn't go down. I just stared for a while, trying to make sense of it. It didn't look like a shelter. There were old metal hooks driven into the beams and something that looked like wire or rope hanging from them. I saw dark stains on the walls, years old, but still visible. The deeper I looked, the worse I felt. It wasn't fear exactly, it was disgust. Like I had just found something that no one was ever supposed to see. I backed away, closed the hatch, and piled rocks on top of it. I didn't want to know what had happened down there. I didn't want to know who built it or why. I left that afternoon. On the way back to the main road, I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see someone behind me. But the land stayed empty, dry, silent. Back in Lubbock, I didn't tell anyone about the cabin. I never reported the hatch, never went back to the website where I found the listing. I tried to put it out of my head, but sometimes I still dream about that place. I hear the footsteps, I smell that rot, and I remember the dark stains on the wall beneath the earth. Whatever happened there wasn't a story. It was real, and I'm glad I got out when I did. I don't usually talk about that trip. It happened a few years ago, 2017 to be exact. I was 29 at the time and working as a maintenance guy at a school in northern Utah. I wasn't married, didn't have kids. I mostly kept to myself, especially after my dad died the year before. He used to take me camping all the time, and after he passed, I started going out on my own. Something about being deep in the woods helped me think. Helped me feel normal for a little while. That fall, I decided to take a week off work and rent a small cabin up in the Uinta Mountains. It was mid-October, and I figured most of the tourists would be gone by then. I found this place called Crow Rock Cabin listed on a backcountry website. It wasn't on Airbnb or anything like that. It was a private listing posted by an older guy named Clay who said he only rented to people with experience in the outdoors. I emailed him, told him I grew up camping and could handle myself in the woods, and a few days later he gave me directions. He said to bring everything I needed because there weren't any stores for miles, and cell reception would be non-existent once I left the highway. The drive up was beautiful. Long stretches of empty road, yellow and orange trees bending in the wind, peaks capped in early snow. I passed maybe 2 cars in the last hour before I turned onto the dirt road leading to the cabin. It was a rough path, more rock than road, and my truck bounced like hell, but I made it up there before sunset. The cabin was smaller than I expected. One room, built out of old gray logs that looked like they'd been there since the 1930s. It sat in a clearing near a narrow stream with a thin footbridge crossing it. The place was backed up against a slope covered in thick pine, and beyond that, nothing but mountains. Felt like I was on the edge of the world. No traffic, no voices, no service. Just wind in the trees and water running downstream. Inside was basic. 1 cot, 1 wood stove, a table and chair, and some shelves stocked with canned food and old tools. There was a logbook, too. A couple of people had stayed there that year. Some guy in June wrote about hearing coyotes every night. Another one in August mentioned a bear walking past the window early one morning. Nothing out of the ordinary. I set up my gear, got a small fire going in the stove, and cooked up a can of chili. After eating, I walked a few yards down the slope and just stood there, listening. The kind of silence you only get way out in the woods. I stayed out until the light drained from the trees, then went back inside, locked the door, and read a paperback until I fell asleep. The first 2 days were peaceful. I did a little hiking around the area, kept close to the stream, and marked my route with red tape just in case. I'd wake up early, boil water on the stove, drink instant coffee, and eat trail mix or jerky. It got cold fast after the sun dipped. I kept a fire going most of the time I was inside. Nights were quiet. Wind would pick up now and then and slap against the old walls, but nothing that bothered me. On the 3rd night, something changed. I'd gone to bed around 10. I wasn't sleeping too well, kept waking up and flipping in the cot. At maybe 2 in the morning, I heard something outside. Not wind, not an animal. It was this sharp, steady sound, like metal on wood. Top. Pause. Top, top. Then silence. I sat up and listened hard. Thought maybe a branch had come loose and was tapping the side of the cabin in the breeze. But there was no wind that night, not even a breeze. The trees weren't moving. The stream was too far to be that loud. Then it came again. Top, 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 top. this time closer to the door. I didn't move, just sat there with the blanket up to my chest, staring at the wooden door. I didn't have a gun, just a hunting knife in my pack and a heavy flashlight beside the cot. I waited, breathing shallow, heart thumping. Then everything went dead quiet. I must have sat there for another hour, frozen. Nothing else happened. I finally laid back down and stared at the ceiling until I passed out from exhaustion. The next morning, I went outside and looked around the cabin. No tracks, no disturbed brush, nothing knocked over. I walked down to the stream, crossed the bridge, and scanned the treeline. Everything looked normal, but something didn't feel right. It was like the air had changed, like I wasn't alone anymore. I told myself it was just nerves, being isolated messes with your mind sometimes. I'd read stories about solo hikers hearing things at night. I figured that was all it was. Still, I kept my knife on me for the rest of the day. That night, I moved the small table in front of the door and leaned a piece of firewood against the window latch. I tried to sleep. I really did. But around 1:30 in the morning, the sound came back.
Top.
Pause.
Top.
Not at the door this time. At the window. I stayed still, staring into the dark. I couldn't see the window from the cot, and I didn't dare move. The tapping stopped. Then I heard faint footsteps, crunching, slow, like someone walking in boots over pine needles and dirt. I reached for my flashlight and held it tight. Didn't turn it on. Just waited. A minute passed, then 2, then 5. Nothing. I eventually stood up and shined the light out the window. Nothing but trees. No movement.
Nos chaps.
No eyes glowing in the beam. The next morning, I decided to leave early. I only had 2 days left anyway, and I wasn't about to spend another night sitting up with a knife in my hand. I packed my gear, cleaned up the cabin, and loaded the truck. I took one last walk around the property, checking for anything that might explain what happened. That's when I found the boot print. It was half covered in dry needles near the back of the cabin, where the slope started. It was wide and deep, like someone had stood there for a while. Definitely not mine. I'd been wearing lighter trail shoes, and these were clearly a thick, rugged sole. Maybe size 12 or 13. Looked like work boots. Old ones. I followed the prints as far as I could. They led up the slope and disappeared into the brush. I drove out that afternoon, bouncing down that rocky road faster than I should have. Once I hit the highway, I didn't stop until I was 2 towns away. I checked into a cheap motel and took the longest shower of my life. When I got home, I emailed Clay. I told him something weird had happened at the cabin. Someone might have been sneaking around at night. He replied a couple of days later, saying he hadn't rented it to anyone else that week and hadn't seen or heard of anyone near there in months. He said he'd go check the property himself the following weekend. I never heard back from him after that. I didn't push it, didn't email again, didn't ask. I never went back up there. Never rented a cabin that remote again, either. These days, if I go out, I stick to campgrounds with other people around. I sleep better that way. Sometimes I think about who or what was out there. Not a ghost, not a monster, just someone, some guy, wandering those woods, maybe watching from the trees, waiting for something. Maybe he lived out there. Maybe he was passing through. Maybe he was just curious. But I know this, the tapping wasn't random. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal. It was someone letting me know they were there. And that's what keeps me up at night. I was 28 when I agreed to take care of my uncle's small farm property for a week while he and his wife went on a trip to the Black Hills in South Dakota. It was September 2022. The weather was still warm during the day but chilly after sundown. I had just gone through a rough breakup and needed some space, so when my uncle asked if I could stay at his place in rural Nebraska and keep an eye on things, Feed the animals, make sure nobody trespassed, water the plants. I said yes without much thought. The place was far out. It sat on about 40 acres of mixed land. Some of it open field, a few patches of trees, a creek that ran dry half the year, and an old weathered barn. The cabin itself was small, wooden, and had no internet or cell signal unless you climbed up the hill about a mile out toward the road. I brought my dog, Chase, a big German Shepherd mix, thinking he'd enjoy the space and help keep me company. The first couple of days were fine, peaceful even. I'd wake up around 7, fix coffee on the propane stove, let Chase run around while I fed the chickens and checked the shed locks. There were only 4 goats, 2 donkeys, and a dozen hens. Nothing too complicated. My uncle's instructions were clear. I followed them like clockwork. On the 3rd night, I noticed something strange when I went to lock up the animals. The back latch on the chicken coop was unhooked. Not wide open, just gently resting closed without the pin. That didn't make sense. I was certain I had locked it the night before. None of the chickens were missing, so I just brushed it off as my mistake. I locked it again and went inside. Later that night, as I sat by the fire pit outside with Chase curled up next to me, I heard this quick rustling out in the tree line behind the barn. It wasn't like wind or a rabbit darting through grass. It was deliberate, something big enough to snap dry twigs as it moved. Chase's ears perked up, and he growled low. I stood up and shined my flashlight but didn't see anything. I kept the beam steady for a minute or two, waited, then finally went back inside and locked the cabin door. The next morning, I noticed one of the goats limping. Nothing serious, just a slight hitch in its walk. There were no signs of injury, no blood, no swelling. But it was odd. I texted my uncle from the hilltop to let him know, and he said goats sometimes twist their legs on rocks or bad footing. That made sense. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, I double-checked every single latch, made sure the barn door was bolted, and even placed a small old toolbox in front of the coop just to notice if it got moved. I left the fire off and sat inside reading by lantern. No TV, no service, just a paperback I had found in the cabin. At around midnight, Chase let out this bark that made me jump. Not his usual bark at deer or squirrels. This one was deep and short, like a warning. I turned off the lantern, looked out through the cabin's tiny front window, and saw nothing. But Chase kept pacing by the door, nose low, ears back. I grabbed the old hunting rifle my uncle kept over the mantel, not loaded, just for show, and held it like it meant something. Nothing happened, not that night. But when I went out in the morning, the toolbox had been moved, just slightly, maybe a foot to the right. The latch on the coop was still in place, though, and none of the animals were missing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there. Person. I checked the perimeter of the barn and found a boot print in the soft dirt. Still fresh. Definitely not mine. I wore running shoes the entire time. It was wide, probably a size 11 or 12, and deep like someone had stood in one place pressing down. I stared at it for a long time, then walked back to the cabin and locked the door behind me. I didn't even want to think about what it could mean. I skipped breakfast, kept Chase close, and drove the old pickup down the dirt path to the edge of the property. There wasn't much around except another farm about a mile out, owned by a reclusive guy named Dwayne, and miles of empty fields beyond that. I didn't see anything unusual, but I still didn't like the idea of someone being close without me knowing. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with the lights off, the lantern dimmed low, and the rifle in my lap. Chase didn't relax either. He sat by the window the whole time, quietly watching. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps. I'm not talking about the little creaks an old cabin makes. These were definite, slow steps moving across the dirt and grass just outside. I didn't breathe. Chase growled low again, almost under his breath. Then there was a knock, just one, and soft, like the back of a fingernail gently tapping wood. I didn't move, neither did Chase. Then nothing. just silence. I stayed frozen like that until the sun started coming up. When I finally stepped outside, there were more prints around the front of the cabin. They came from the side of the barn, circled the cabin, and disappeared back into the trees. I looked for tire marks or a bike trail, anything to show how they got in, but there was nothing, just prints and grass. I stayed up on the hill long enough to send another message to my uncle. I told him I thought someone was sneaking around at night, maybe messing with the animals. He messaged back hours later and said Dwayne sometimes got drunk and wandered, but never did anything harmful. Still, that didn't sit right with me. I didn't know Dwayne. I didn't want to assume anything. But if it was him, why would he knock? Why not just come say something? That day, I kept Chase with me everywhere. I brought him into the barn while I cleaned out one of the goat pens, and I kept checking over my shoulder constantly. Around noon, I noticed a small aluminum object sticking out from under the back wheel of the trailer parked behind the barn. It was a knife, a simple folding knife, dirty with dried mud. I didn't touch it. I left it there, walked inside, locked the door, and sat down. The final night, I barely functioned. I had already packed most of my stuff. I was supposed to stay one more night, but my mind was made up. As soon as daylight broke, I would be gone. Around 9:30 p.m., I killed the lights, sat in the dark with Chase again. The air was colder that night. Everything outside was dead quiet. Then I heard the chickens going wild. I bolted up, grabbed the rifle again out of instinct, and ran toward the coop with Chase bounding ahead. My flashlight caught movement just beyond the coop fence. Someone was running, fast, out toward the tree line. Tall figure wearing a hoodie or jacket. I yelled, but they didn't stop. They disappeared into the dark, and I didn't follow. I checked the coop. The latch had been broken off. 2 chickens were gone. A third injured and fluttering madly. Feathers everywhere. I ran back inside, locked every window and door, and sat with the rifle until dawn. That morning, I didn't feed the animals. I didn't clean anything. I threw my bag in the truck bed, whistled for Chase, and drove away down that dirt path without looking back once. I stopped at the neighbor's place on the way and told him someone had been trespassing and stealing animals. He didn't seem surprised. Said something about kids coming up from the next town over now and then. But he also said Dwayne hadn't lived there for over a year. Apparently, Dwayne had passed away the previous fall. His place had been empty ever since. I told my uncle everything when he got back 2 days later. He was shocked, said he'd install cameras and fix the coop. I didn't ask him to invite me back. To this day, I don't know who was out there, if it was one person or more, if they meant harm or just liked messing with people. But I know what I saw. I know someone knocked on that door. I know someone moved my toolbox, broke the latch, and took those chickens. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. And I never want to go back to that place again.